Is the Earth hollow? There are various versions of the hollow Earth hypothesis, with claims of varying degrees of crazy, such as the idea that on the inner surface of the hollow Earth there are extinct animals, dinosaurs, Vikings, advanced civilizations, aliens, and also the idea that we ourselves live inside the hollow Earth on a concave surface, and the universe we see is just an illusion. But before you dismiss this hypothesis as crazy nonsense, no, I haven't lost my mind, and no, it's not April Fool's Day yet. So I won't be asking, maybe we should give this hypothesis a chance. I'll say something else. Hollow Earth is not just a modern conspiracy theory, although of course this aspect is also there. Originally, it appeared as what could even be called a scientifically valid hypothesis in some sense. It was trying to explain certain observations. This idea, in one form or another, has been around for hundreds or even thousands of years, and we can highlight three versions of it: mythological, scientific, and yes, conspiracy-related. People often ask, why even waste time on this? It's obviously nonsense. Well, first of all, judging by the fact that there are people who believe in this nonsense, it's clear that it's not so obvious to everyone. And even in what can be called debunking, I often use these ideas as an excuse to talk about science and how things actually work in the universe. Plus, there is often an interesting story. I myself avoided this topic for a long time until I took some free time to read more about the hollow Earth and found quite a lot of interesting stuff. So why did some scientists once believe that the Earth could be hollow? How has this idea evolved over the centuries? Why do people still believe in this, and what are their arguments? Could Earth be hollow under any conditions? And how do flat earthers argue with hollow earthers? The battles between conspiracy theorists are certainly interesting. So today we'll talk about all this and more. I'm Andrei, and this is Cosmos Elementary. People have been wondering about what lies beneath the surface of our planet for thousands of years. However, while the ancient Greeks were able to indirectly determine the shape of the Earth and understand that it was spherical, what's beneath the surface is a more complex matter. Even now, with our modern technologies, although we have a pretty good understanding of the internal structure of our planet, most of the information we get about it comes from methods that can be considered indirect. So unlike the Earth seen in photos from space, we've only managed to dig into the Earth's surface to a depth of about a dozen kilometers at best. No one has seen these internal layers with their own eyes, but that's not necessarily a problem. In ancient times, people didn't have access to indirect methods like seismology, gravitational and magnetic measurements, and so on, so they had to resort to imagination. The existence of some kind of underground world is mentioned in mythologies and religions of various cultures. Often these underground realms were analogues of hell, or simply a place where souls go after death. We won't go into detail listing and analyzing all of them. It's quite understandable why people in ancient times came to such conclusions, having no way to actually check what was hidden beneath the earth. All the more surprising is that some people still come to the same conclusions, even though we now have the means to investigate, but more on that later. In the introduction, I mentioned that for some time the hollow Earth theory had a certain, one might say, even scientific foundation. In 1692, none other than Edmund Halley himself proposed that our planet might be hollow. Halley was a prominent scientist, an astronomer, physicist, mathematician, and more. Yes, the same Halley after whom the famous comet is named. But Halley's hollow Earth idea wasn't just some random nonsense he came up with just for the sake of it. As a scientist, he used this concept to try to explain certain data available at the time. There are two key points here: the density ratio of the Earth and the Moon, and the behavior of Earth's magnetic pole. Let's start with the Moon. In the first edition of the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy by Isaac Newton, his most important work, which, by the way, was published with the help of Halley, Newton made an estimate of the mass ratio between the Earth and the Moon. According to Newton's estimate, the Earth was 26 times more massive than the Moon. There were also estimates of difference in density, and in those calculations the Moon appeared to be significantly denser than our planet, with a ratio of 9:5. Density estimates were made, among other things, by comparing the influence of the Sun and the Moon on tides. But as we now understand, these estimates were incorrect. Just like with the mass, Newton's first calculations were off by about a factor of 3. The actual Earth-to-Moon mass ratio is 1:81. But Halley relied on Newton's calculations and suggested that since the Earth is much less dense than the Moon, this could be explained by the presence of a large cavity inside the Earth. Sounds logical? Well, as I mentioned, besides density, Halley was also prompted by the behavior of the magnetic poles. He constructed a specific model of the Earth's internal structure in an attempt to explain this behavior. Now we know that the north and the south magnetic poles do not perfectly align with geographical poles. Moreover, the magnetic poles are not stationary. They constantly migrate. For example, here is how the position of the magnetic North Pole has changed from the year 1900 to 2015. And this could actually be a problem, especially hundreds of years ago, if you relied on a compass for navigation, checking it against maps, only for it to give different readings than, say, 50 years prior. Halley was troubled by the issue of the magnetic poles for many years. Almost 10 years later, he presented his hollow Earth model. In 1683, he concluded that the anomalous behavior of the poles could be explained by the idea that there are actually 4 poles, not just 2. 2 in the north and 2 in the south. However, he couldn't explain why there were so many poles or why they moved. He called it a secret unknown to mankind. Although there were attempts to explain this, like suggesting that the movement was caused by shifting masses of iron within the Earth, the idea wasn't very convincing. In his 1692 work, Halley wrote that the existing attempts to explain the behavior of the magnetic poles were inadequate, and he concluded that something must be happening deep within the Earth's interior. Interestingly, he was essentially right in suspecting that something was going on beneath the surface. However, the further conclusions he drew were not quite accurate. Halley had already suspected the possibility of a hollow Earth, but how does this help solve the problem of the magnetic poles? The idea was that inside, it wasn't just emptiness, but several spheres, one inside the other, like in a Russian nesting doll. In his model, the Earth's outer shell was 800 kilometers or about 500 miles thick. Inside there were 3 more layers. The next one was about the size of Venus, another further in was the size of Mars, and at the center, a core the size of Mercury. The inner shells rotated independently but at different speeds, which could explain the generation of the magnetic field and the behavior of the magnetic poles. These spheres did not collide as they were held in place by gravity. He drew a parallel with Saturn's rings. At that time, it wasn't known that the rings also rotate and aren't fixed in place. What's even more interesting, Halley added that between those spheres there could be cavities, possibly filled with an atmosphere. This atmosphere might glow, and in fact, life could exist on these layers inside. These ideas didn't really add anything to the model or help solve the problem of the magnetic field. However, they provided a lot of material for science fiction writers and conspiracy theorists, sparking ideas for hundreds of years to come. Although we now know that this model is incorrect, it is still interesting that, in some sense, it was even ahead of its time. The Earth does indeed consist of distinct, well-defined layers, and there is even differential rotation in the core. Moreover, the behavior of the liquid and solid parts of the core is what creates and influences the magnetic field. But unfortunately, no giant cavity is suitable for life. Although in this case Halley's imagination ran a bit wild, the whole story still resembles a scientific process, albeit 17th century science. There were certain observations, and to explain them, a hypothesis was formulated. The problem is that some of the initial data were incorrect. The scientific community abandoned the idea fairly quickly, partially thanks to experiments measuring Earth's density. As is often the case, those who started believing in this idea later justified their belief in part by the authority of a figure like Halley. And although ideally we should not appeal to authority but instead test the ideas themselves, in discussions about the hollow earth, another authoritative name often comes up, that of the famous mathematician Leonhard Euler. Conspiracy theorists and pseudoscience proponents love to somehow drag well-known scientists and their ideas to support their side. And often in one sentence they'll claim the falsehood of science and then immediately use scientific arguments if they serve their purpose. It might seem odd, well, not really, but even great scientists can make mistakes, often due to lack of data or simply because everyone is still human. For example, Einstein himself constructed a model of the universe that was static and not expanding. And his early arguments can now be used by modern proponents of alternative cosmology, saying something like, "Look, even Einstein himself talked about a static universe, so clearly it's not expanding." Yeah, but he made that model in 1917, and since then a lot was discovered during his lifetime and work, including the expansion of the universe, and he eventually abandoned that model. But he can also make up a story and falsely claim that a prominent scientist supported your alternative idea. With Euler, it seems like this is exactly what happened. For example, supporters of the hollow earth theory mention him and claim that Euler constructed a model of a hollow earth. They claim that unlike Halley, who had several concentric spheres, Euler's model featured a single shell with an empty interior, and at the very center, there is a small star about 1000 kilometers or 620 miles in diameter. Well, since a prominent mathematician made such a claim, it clearly suggests that there's something to it. What's interesting is that such statements can be found not only on questionable websites, but even in seemingly reasonable articles about the hollow earth. In some cases, it's clarified that the sources are questionable, but in others, like this article on the Big Think website, there is no such mention. It simply says Euler proposed a single-shell hollow Earth with a small sun at the center. And that's it. Is it true? Probably not. Here, the author of this article, Ed Sandeifer, has already done all the work for me. Unlike other sources, this one actually includes references to sources and Euler's original works. In reality, Euler didn't write anything like that, nor did he believe the Earth could be hollow. The closest thing that could be stretched here is the thought experiment he described when he imagined what would happen if a tunnel were drilled through the center of the Earth and an object were dropped into it. But no giant cavity with a sun at the center. But the person who really actively pushed for the hollow earth theory was John Cleves Symmes. He wasn't a scientist though. He was a captain in the American Army living in the 18th and 19th centuries. Symmes is another prominent name in this story, and he added his own interesting modifications: giant holes. It seems that he based his idea on Halley's model. Like Halley, Symmes envisioned a series of spheres and empty spaces inside the Earth, where life could exist. However, Symmes took it further by making this underground world accessible for visitation. He believed that on both poles, the Earth had giant openings, 2,300 kilometers or 1,400 miles in diameter, through which one could enter the interior of the planet. This is what the Earth would look like according to Symmes. Did he publish a scientific paper with detailed arguments? Not really. He published this note, and I quote, "To all the world I declare the Earth is hollow and habitable within, containing a number of solid concentric spheres, one within the other, and that it is open at the poles 12 or 16 degrees. I pledge my life in support of this truth, and I am ready to explore the hollow, if the world will support and aid me in the undertaking." It's cool that you can just make up some giant holes in the Earth and announce them to the world. Unlike Halley, who initially had a scientific problem he was trying to solve with a new hypothesis, Symmes simply came up with the hypothesis out of nowhere. It's worth saying that he probably truly believed in this idea and devoted the rest of his life to it. He traveled to different cities, giving lectures where he showcased a homemade wooden model of the globe that would open up to reveal the internal layers and cavities, but most importantly, he wanted to test his hypothesis. In his version of the hollow Earth, it wasn't necessary to dig deep underground. All you had to do was reach the openings at the poles. He wanted to embark on an expedition to the North Pole to find the entrance to the underground world. Symmes supporters even began petitioning the government to fund the whole endeavor. In 1822, Senator Richard Thompson addressed Congress with a proposal to send an expedition consisting of 2 ships. During the debates in Congress, there was even a suggestion that it would be a good idea to include members of the Foreign Affairs Committee in that expedition, just in case there was contact with underground civilizations. Sounds powerful, but the Congress didn't back the initiative, so the expedition never happened. Well, that was the 19th century. Sure, Symmes came up with this idea of holes, but at least he wanted to go explore them and find out, and back then, there was no way to observe the Earth from space. It's all more surprising that there are still people who believe in the hollow Earth and even in the holes in the Earth to this day. Of course, the idea that a whole new world could be hidden inside a planet is very appealing. And it's no surprise that this idea found its way into the works of science fiction writers. There are quite a few examples, and the most famous of them is probably Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. But that's understandable in works of fiction. The surprising part is that some people take it far more seriously, not as fiction at all. As with most conspiracy theories, there isn't a single, widely accepted, quote-unquote theory for the hollow Earth that all supporters adhere to without exception. There are different versions, and the differences can range from small details to fundamental ones, but they are largely based on what I've already mentioned. Let's take as an example one prominent representative. Another notable figure is Rodney M. Clough, the author of the book The Biggest World Secret: The Earth is Hollow. In principle, his description of the hollow Earth is similar to Symmes' version. It's also a planet with a cavity inside, openings at the poles, and a sun at the center. Inside, of course, people live, like Vikings and stuff, and also Germans who fled after World War II. There might also be aliens and UFOs that people occasionally observe. These flying saucers are supposedly coming out of the holes at the poles. Why not? In an interview that Clough gave to Vice a few years ago, he told that he first heard about this idea as a teenager, became intrigued, and began studying scientific, historical, and spiritual evidence supporting the idea that the Earth is hollow, and this convinced him. And by the way, he believes that not only the Earth is hollow, but also other planets, moons, and even asteroids. It was so convincing that back in 1981, he took his wife, children, and moved to Alaska to be closer to the hole in the ground and perhaps find it. He did not find the hole, but he did find supporters instead. So why do Clough and his followers believe in this? Well, they can reference the historical arguments I've already mentioned, like those of Halley and Symmes, but we're in the space age now, and the Earth has been photographed from space in every possible way. So why are there no visible holes in the planet? Of course, it's a conspiracy, an international banking conspiracy aimed at hiding the truth about the Earth. And not to let us, mere mortals, make contact with the mega civilization of the underground dwellers. Flight and ship routes are supposedly planned so that, God forbid, they don't stumble upon the holes. Apparently, the photos from space are all faked, but what's even more interesting is that it seems that they don't always manage to hide it completely. Look at this. What is this if not a giant hole in the satellite images from the ESSA satellites? These were taken back in the late 1960s. So, did someone mess up and forget to cover up the secret passage into the Earth depths? Actually, it's much simpler than that. These aren't single frame shots, but a mosaic of multiple images. Given the particular characteristics of the satellites and how multiple frames are stitched together into a panorama, this hole is just an artifact of the panorama creation process. It's like saying that because the textures at the poles on Google Maps look strange, it means that they're hiding something, without knowing the specifics of the orbits the images are taken from, how textures are applied to a 3D sphere, and so on. It's all a misunderstanding of a technical processes involved. And now there are not only mosaic images, but also direct shots where you can clearly see the poles and confirm that there are no holes there. Of course, it's clear that won't convince conspiracy theorists. Although, what is more likely? A secret international organization is hiding giant holes at the poles from the whole world, and inside the hollow Earth there are aliens? Or we have a photo from space and there is nothing there. Klaff also claims that some people have managed to enter these holes. He says that there are first-hand accounts to back this up. For example, he mentions alleged testimonies from Karl Unger, a member of the crew of a German submarine, which supposedly in 1943, during an expedition to the South Pole, entered the Earth through an underwater passage. The crew is said to have been greeted inside by representatives of a highly advanced civilization. And there's also a supposed secret diary of Admiral Richard Byrd, where he allegedly describes how in 1947 he saw lands full of greenery and mammoths at the North Pole. However, the truth is that during that time, the Admiral was actually at the South Pole, not the North Pole. There were even some who claimed to have been born inside the hollow Earth. Well, but that wasn't enough for Klaff. Like Symmes, hundreds of years before him, he wanted to see the holes at the poles with his own eyes and explore the inner part of the Earth himself. He and some of his supporters even planned to set off on an icebreaker from Murmansk, Russia, to the North Pole, but for various reasons the expedition kept getting delayed and it never happened. I don't know what they were hoping for. If the global conspiracy is hiding such a secret from the entire planet, and then they can just hop on an icebreaker ship, sail off, and find the opening? The idea of the hollow Earth is definitely not as popular as the flat Earth theory. The flat Earth movement has a large following with numerous forums, YouTubers, conferences, while those who believe in the hollow Earth are far fewer. But it's amusing how some conspiracy theorists criticize each other. Klaff, in an interview with Vice, actually said, "The flat earthers are obviously wrong. The world is a sphere and it's hollow. I don't think flat earthers don't have a leg to stand on, but I respect their opinion." And in turn, flat earthers naturally mock hollow earthers, believing that they are the ones who are wrong. Ironic. Although this video isn't an expose, I think most of you don't need proof that the Earth is not hollow. Unless you're a conspiracy theorist. In which case, hi, welcome. It's cool that you've stuck around and watched all the way to this point in the video. Maybe what comes next will be useful. The simplest argument as to why the Earth cannot be hollow is its density. The same logic that led Halley to incorrect conclusions now leads us to the opposite. The average density of our planet is about 5.5 grams per cubic centimeter. The density of the Earth's crust is 2.6 grams per cubic centimeter. If there was a cavity beneath the crust, the overall density of the Earth would be lower than the density of the crust and not higher. But as we can see, this is not the case, and modern density estimates of our planet are quite accurate. Next, we have gravitational measurements from satellites in orbit, which allow us to create maps of mass distribution. Through seismic studies, we obtain information about what lies inside our planet, what layers it consists of. I talked about how it works in some of my previous videos. Again, these studies show no cavities. And in the end, gravity simply wouldn't allow a massive object like Earth to exist with a cavity inside. After reaching a certain mass limit, all bodies due to gravity tend to take the shape of a sphere, so a hollow Earth simply wouldn't be able to withstand it and it would collapse. Well, unless it was built by someone from some unknown materials. But then, following Klaff's logic, were all planets and even asteroids built by someone too? And of course, no tiny sun could be floating in the center of the Earth. A star of that size, judging only by the size, that could be a stellar remnant. But any full-fledged star is much larger and more massive. And there's also an even crazier idea that we ourselves live on the inner surface of a sphere. This idea was supposedly proposed by Cyrus Tidd, who was a cult leader and a self-proclaimed messiah. Well, of course, who else? He called it a cellular cosmology, where we live on the inner surface of a sphere and everything we observe in the universe is an illusion, created by some kind of a solar mechanism, with stars being reflections of lights from this mechanism. In general, it is somewhat understandable how such ideas originated hundreds of years ago, but it's much harder to grasp that now. At this point, it is impossible to avoid conspiracies, because all the data contradicts the idea, and in order to believe in it, you'd have to reject a lot of things. Thanks for watching. Links to all of the sources are, as always, down below in the description, and if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more videos in future. They are coming. Bye.